and welcome back to the Reliably Intermittent Podcast. You've got both of us today back again for the first time in a little while. As always, I'm Aaron Ware with Clemens Nelson and Associates, and with me, as well, not always, but usual, Drew Esposito. Hey, Drew, how we doing?
Doing good, man. You know, living the perpetual dream of this recount, right? Seeing what the heck's going to happen.
You know what? And I'm just so excited that we've chosen today to take a deep dive into that. You know, we just know everybody's here for me and Drew to talk county by county breakdowns, polling data, demographics, just all that. We're just going to dive right into Maricopa County and DeKalb County, or I'm sorry, DeKalb.
Sharpies.
All of it. Sharpies, pencil. No, obviously I'm kidding. You all have heard enough of that, and you don't need two basic white dudes to tell you about demographic data on stuff we have no idea what any of it is or it means. No, I think instead, let's talk about something I think under the election, I think Drew and I both would agree that it's relatively underreported. That's drugs. Drugs in the election. And I'm not talking about personal consumption to get through the last 8 days. It's more about the different election topics and ballot initiatives across the country, all the way from, black tar heroin to medical marijuana and everywhere in between. So Drew, why don't you give everybody a little primer on what we saw last week?
Yeah, I think kind of the unsung hero of the 2020 election was Mary Jane, was good old marijuana. Swept the board, flipped all the states that didn't have it. It was unanimous, 100%. There are 5 states with marijuana on the ballot, and all 5 passed. Not all the same ballot initiatives, obviously, but you had Arizona pass recreational use. They were already medical. New Jersey passed recreational use. South Dakota did the full kitchen sink, and they did recreational and medical at the same time. Mississippi came on board down south with medical, and Montana passed recreational. So 4 out of the 5 states that had it on their ballot had recreation in there. So that brings a whopping total up to 15, and the District of Columbia that all allow recreational use. And I think the tally total now is 35 states in this glorious union have medical marijuana or recreational or both. And then another, I want to say 7 states have like a CBD oil only, or a variation on that. So we're looking at north of 40 states have supported the use of marijuana or marijuana derived chemicals.
Some kind of cannabis related.
Yeah, for medical purposes. And just to throw an extra wrinkle in there, I think right after the election happened, or within a couple days, Texas introduced, it's called a pre-bill. So in their 2021 session, they're planning on taking up legalization of marijuana. So you may have the Lone Star State get on board as well. So it's pretty nuts out there.
Well, and I was going to say reading the tea leaves, but reading the 5 leaves, as it were.
Yeah.
You got Oregon out there that is just kind of turning into a free for all, like Amsterdam West, I guess, where they decriminalized like all of the drugs, essentially. Am I understanding that one right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's basically like a parking ticket. I don't think there's like an escalation that, you get caught with heroin, it's $100 fine, and then you get caught a second time within 6 months, it's a $200 fine. I think just every single time it's $100 fine. Keep in mind, or entering treatment. So like if you've got the money, you basically can just use a litany of hardcore drugs. It was definitely heroin, oxy, LSD, meth, So the list goes on and on. I mean, these are all going to be tier one, tier two controlled substances.
So two things on that. Following that, I'm going to encourage everyone to listen to the disclaimer at the end of this episode that we put at the end of every episode. None of this is legal advice. We're not your lawyer. If for whatever reason we misread that and there is an escalator, that's on you. So just bear that in mind if you're going to go boot black tar heroin. Two, what I found cool about Oregon, or at least insofar as what they're doing under this program, not taking a position on meth use. We'll just say that. Probably not a great idea, but hey, you do you. What I found neat about it was that addiction recovery center stuff, the fine or that is being funded, it seems like, from the tax proceeds on the marijuana sales.
Correct. That's what I read. The blurb I read summarizing the law was that the millions it's going to cost, the multi-millions it's going to cost to fund the addiction recovery centers are directly derived from the tax sales from marijuana.
Sure. Well, and as we've seen from some of the guinea pig states that did recreational marijuana first, your Colorados, your Californias, those states. I mean, we're not reporting it. It's been reported. They're deriving substantial revenues, tax revenues from that sale and consumption. I think that's why you're probably seeing a lot of the prevalence of this coming up in other areas. They kind of want to wet their beak on it, and they're seeing that some of the horror stories, net negatives, may not be. Maybe that's media coverage. Maybe that's whatever. Again, we're not a political podcast here. The state of Colorado is largely trumpeting the tax revenue coming from that decision from their voters to approve recreational marijuana. So we'll see how, that kind of thought experiment turned real experiment out in Oregon goes on the other drugs.
I think there's probably going to be a lot of data on the revenue driven, not just on a tax basis too, from the rural farming communities, because when they made the change to the agriculture bill or to the new budget with McConnell, where they reclassified hemp from a Schedule 1 or 2, whatever it was, they changed its schedule status. So now all of these CBD products can now be produced, and that was like height of the pandemic. That was no, that was pre-pandemic. I'm sorry. That was height of the soybean drama with China, and all of these farmers with soybeans and the taxes, they were losing millions, giving them another crop to farm and then get out there to have another product. So I think you're going to see sales tax base, and you're going to see these farming communities that have flipped. I don't think we have the data from it because that was just happening at the end of last year, transferring into the new fiscal year. So we'll see that come out too. So it's an interesting time.
Well, and I'm sure our listeners are at this point wondering, other than just general curiosity and theoretical interest in these types of future products, why are Drew and Aaron talking about this on an ostensibly human resources related podcast? Obviously, you're going to run into situations as employers where your employees may want to partake in this new recreational pastime, or potentially, depending on the state, as Drew mentioned, it's going to vary widely state by state, if they want to or need to partake in the medical area of marijuana, right? So focusing this back in on, again, ostensibly what this podcast is all about, the employer-employee relationship, HR, that sort of a thing. Drew and I both in our careers have talked quite a bit about drugs in the workplace, drug testing, those sorts of things. So Drew, why don't we look at where we operate primarily out of in Ohio, which didn't change this time, but which did change two years ago? How long ago are we talking about now?
It may have been 3.
Good Lord. We've been doing this
because it took a while to implement. Right.
Right.
Because they had to put all
approved, and then there was a lag time.
Yeah.
But Ohio is CBD approved, but I think more
In
germane to
medical
what we're
use.
talking about, medical marijuana state.
Yep.
Highly regulated, highly limited on the different conditions that are medical marijuana approved.
Absolutely.
But what they did in Ohio, and we can juxtapose this with some of the other states that just tweaked their laws or completely flipped and overhauled their laws. Essentially, what Ohio did was right into that law. Employers essentially don't have to honor, be concerned with an employee's medical marijuana approval. And what I mean by that is specifically in the law, there is no ADA or Ohio equivalent of the Americans with Disabilities Act protection for employees for medical marijuana. It's explicitly written into the law. It's not protected, essentially. I mean, the simplest way of putting it.
Yeah.
It's kind of user beware, but it's still testable. It's still a terminable offense, all those things. And there's no course of action for an employee if removed for that under the Ohio medical marijuana provisions.
Yeah. I think there's also an automatic provision that it kicks you out of workers' comp, kicks you out of unemployment, maybe if that's the situation too, that if that's the reason, it's like an automatic disqualifier for some of the other administrative benefits that an employee could potentially be under.
Sure. I mean, I would hazard a guess to say it's one of the more, it's explicitly written more restrictive because it's the defined conditions that you can obtain medical marijuana for is a relatively limited list. But from a practical standpoint, if you have to work and you're at an employer that drug tests, that cost benefit analysis is probably tending toward cost than benefit, from that practical standpoint. It, I think is intended in the way it operates in Ohio, that it is an incredibly limited utility situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's in direct contrast. And this is where the wonderful internet of all things, Google machine, where people get terrible advice, is you'll have your employees that are just like, at least here in Ohio, right? Employees, when this happened, every single employee, every single employer, we were getting calls saying, well, I've got a valid medical prescription. They can't do anything about it. And you got employees that relied on that and then would just get fired, right? It's like, because they would read about a case in New Jersey or a case in Rhode Island or Massachusetts, that or some of these states where the law,
California,
it was crafted differently. And people really need to be aware, employers and employees, about the nuances of these things.
Well, and this is even messier when you consider that everything we've been talking about so far is state law driven, right? It's like we talk about with everybody, like you mentioned at the top of this, it's state by state, different ballot initiatives. It's different state by states flipping, making that thing legal. But that completely ignores the elephant in the room. That is, all of these things are still scheduled drugs under federal law. That who in the world knows? You had the situation under the Obama administration where they weren't necessarily enforcing that in the same way where states had taken an action, followed by the Trump administration that didn't have the same, marching orders or guidance. Who knows what's going to happen with whatever our next administration is? Again, not getting into that. You all gotten enough of that over the last 8 days. But the point is we don't know what the federal situation is going to be. But what we have heard from Senator Schumer from New York is, at least from what is currently the Senate minority, a move to put marijuana legislation essentially on the agenda for this term.
Which you think would actually, even though they're minority or majority, with 35 states having medical approval, 42, give or take a state, have the CBD edition.
Sure.
You think whoever is in the majority, it doesn't matter. The majority of the states already approve this. So you think that their senators are likely.
Well, do you
Famous
still have
last
that?
words, right?
Do you still have that map that we looked at earlier that you can share?
Yeah, let me see if I can pull that up real quick.
And while he's looking for that, I mean, if we can get it pulled up, what it's going to show you is a pretty, I think, stark contrast between all of the different states that have approved something versus the states that haven't. And you're going to see probably more green because the color they've used, because, you know, branding is green on this map. There's a heck of a lot of green on this map and very little that isn't.
Coming
And
your
the
way.
green represents, okay, great. Here we go. As you can see, there's a heck of a lot of green, and the darkest green is recreational.
Yep.
And trending down towards light green being, you know,
Right over
just
here.
medical or whatever the case may be, decriminalized.
Mm-hmm.
What you're looking at there is essentially the incredible majority, the most populated states, some what you might think of as atypical states to approve this, see Mississippi,
Yeah.
in some form or fashion, the use of marijuana.
Again, and you're stretching out here
advocating.
over to Montana. Like that's, you know, I mean, it's really spread.
Dakota, yeah.
It's not just coastal, you know, it's
You
really
could overlap, yeah, you could overlap this with the electoral college map that we all saw ad nauseum for the last 8 days. And you're going to see, I think, pretty bipartisan support. Again, what does that mean today? Right? Take a look at where you are. Take a look at your state. Take a look at what the rules are. But what I think, again, the 5 leaves are dictating is that you're seeing a shift in policy on this. And I
100%.
think what you need to be doing, depending on where you are, is take a look at what essentially, again, federally illegal today.
And
bear that in mind.
Yeah, and there's a nuance there too. Like this is where it's even more tricky too. Since they changed the classification of the hemp plant, right? Different than the marijuana plant, right? Which has this specific designated THC level. CBD products that are derived from federally regulated, these farms that have been federally certified and approved, those are legal products, right? And that if it's not, most states have adopted their agricultural boards as the reviewing agencies, and if they don't, then it goes to the feds. So that's a little nuance. So as these farms come up, people may have these policies that talk about CBD and all that stuff and saying it's not permitted. Under the ADA, the federal law, which does apply universally if you meet the employee threshold, right? If you have over X employees and it falls under, even if your state says no, if you're one of those 5 states that everything is illegal, there's not even an exemption for CBD. Well, if it's coming from a federally authorized, qualified plant and it's a CBD product, that's going to be an ADA violation. It's going to be a valid prescription under the ADA. So it really gets nuanced.
And let's go to New Jersey for a minute, because up until last week, essentially Ohio and New Jersey had very similar medical marijuana situations, right? Well, New Jersey last week, the electorate decided to approve recreational marijuana. And as part of this, what essentially went into the law was that, and I'll read it to you just because I think it's important. No employer shall refuse to hire or employ any person or shall discharge from employment or take any adverse action against any employee with respect to pay, blah, 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 blah. Because that person does or does not smoke, vape, aerosolize, or otherwise use cannabis items unless, and this is where it gets fun, unless the employer has a rational basis for doing so, which is reasonably related to the employment, including the responsibilities of the employee or prospective employee. So essentially what they did was, hey, y'all can't do anything to somebody that's using cannabis unless you have a rational basis based off the job.
My favorite standard for HR, the good old reasonable person standard.
Reasonable person, rational basis. What's a rational basis, you ask? I don't know. And unfortunately, nobody's going to be able to know until this thing gets litigated ad nauseum. You know, we don't work with anybody in New Jersey. But my guess is you're going to see things like this become more and more the standard as this thing goes until the feds do some kind of blanket thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's really going to be shooting by the hip, right? I mean, like if you want to say from a reasonable person, rational basis, I cannot have my drug counselors utilizing any drugs, right? But even then is a tough pitch, because are you going to tell me that a drug counselor who is on like pain medication, right, is somehow disqualified because, like, it's
Law enforcement,
law enforcement,
firefighters,
firefighters.
and the ever popular question we get, I don't know, a handful of times a year, what can we do about our employees off duty conduct versus if they come in stoned,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now with that change, what does that mean? What is our ability to regulate? What is our ability to prove? What is our ability to investigate off duty conduct, where again, the thing that the big bad boogeyman that has always been there just became legal? What can we do with somebody's off duty time?
Yeah.
If there's no evidence, there's no reasonable suspicion, there's no whatever that they've ever been on duty having consumed.
And then it's I think it's always been the biggest wrinkle in dealing with marijuana use or marijuana positivity in the workforce is the under the influence part, right? Like it's so different. It's so much different than alcohol or other drugs, where it's this really distinct and defined shelf life. Whereas someone could smoke some marijuana or take, have some creams or, an oil or whatever they have you. And that could be in their bloodstream for, 10, 15, 20, 30 days. And I don't care if you've never used marijuana in your life, right? Let's go. If you went to any public school, probably in the nation, like everyone is understood that if one of your friends like smoked marijuana or used marijuana and got drug tested, like they could test positive for up to 30 days after. And I don't think anybody believed that if you smoked marijuana, you were high 30 days later. Right. So like, that's like the under the influence. How do you prove the under the influence part? Really challenging, really difficult. How are you going to be advising your clients, or how did you advise your clients here in Ohio when we were dealing with the medical side? I guess maybe we had it easy because there was no.
Yeah, I think for our purpose right now, it's easy. Obviously, take into account that in Ohio, the way they wrote the law, there's no real repercussions to essentially doing what they've always done when it comes to marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
Two, it's still federally illegal. And we work with so many public sector employers that there's kind of that added wrinkle to it of the public trust, the public employee being paid with tax dollars, those kinds of things. But ultimately, it's still relatively easy in Ohio. You've got know the job, whether it's a reasonable suspicion job, a safety sensitive kind of a without suspicion testing program, whatever the case may be. Essentially, you don't have to do anything different than you did before. If we get something like we did in New Jersey, then it becomes a much quirkier issue in that we've got to be able, if you want to continue maintaining the status quo, then you're going to have to be able to articulate that rational basis, right? You're going to have to look at your job. You're going to have to look at the job at issue. You're going to have to look at how we regulate, how we test, how we can essentially justify whatever position it is that we're taking where we say, no, you can't do that, if that's the position you want to take.
Yeah. I think if the trend, right, if where we're trending is leading towards mass acceptance and even and more recreational use. And I've kind of been saying this with marijuana use, even in the medical standpoint, which is I told my clients, what are you guys scared about? It's alcohol's a legal drug and you do not let your employees drink alcohol at work, right? Like there's nothing that stops you from implementing
Mhm.
reasonable and rational work rules, like,
Mhm.
so like, and now the under the influence, that's the challenging part, right? If someone can't come to work drunk, because we'll be able to tell. The marijuana one's tough, but using at work, very easy to tell and enforce. Like, hey,
Yeah.
you can't, you know, empty out, your sack of gummy bears and be chomping them down, having a giggle fit, where you're high off a kite trying to deal customer service on the phone, or if
Mhm.
the speed of your document scanning or whatever, goes from 60 docs a minute down to 5, or if I see your YouTube channel, how you've gotten caught up watching like surprised hamsters for 6 hours of the day. You know what I mean? Like, if I because we have a public perception, whether you're private or public company, like I don't want people, getting high outside my business. I think the employer has a defensible position in those cases. So
Sure.
you don't let people drink beer at work. You don't let them drink beer at lunch on their own time, right? That's always, it's my own time, I should be able to do it. No, it's not how it works.
Right.
So
There's a certain amount. There's a certain modicum of, I guess, regulatable conduct. That's not going to change.
yeah,
It's how much into employees' private time, essentially, our employer is going to be able to go. And honestly, until we see something different here where we are, it's academic.
yeah,
If you're out there where some of these things have changed, then we would, I think, encourage you to take a look at what it is that you're now held to that you weren't last Monday, because ultimately that's going to dictate what you can and can't do, and how you're going to be able to position yourself to take whatever action you think is appropriate based off the operation that you run.
I think that's the criteria too. It's almost like doing an analysis of your positions on whether you're salary exempt or not salary. Like if you're going to show why it is not reasonable or rational, you should have some articulable facts. Like what's the purpose of your agency? Why can't they um,
Yep.
utilize this drug on their break? Why can't they utilize it medically? Right?
Yeah.
Because even with a medical exception, right, if it creates an undue hardship or something like that, or if they can't perform the essential functions, so
Well,
like if you need
let's
to,
let's look at New Jersey real quick. Like,
yeah,
we talk a lot about the public sector because we work with that so much. But let's take an entity that kind of runs like a general contracting shop. So you got guys that maybe run backhoes all the way to the folks that work in the office and process the POs, or salespeople or whatever. You're going to have to look job by job, because my guess is, CDL holders, this stuff may not change.
mm-hmm,
you
yeah,
know so if you've got folks that have to run a CDL or have a CDL license to do what their job entails, maybe you come back to, there's your rational basis. Hey, you can't do that because your job requires X, Y, and Z.
yeah,
Versus your salesperson, who maybe that makes them more friendly. I don't know. But if
yeah.
they're producing, or how do you regulate the different types of functions within your organization?
Maybe they'll bond with some new clients, right?
Yeah.
Over their milligram dosage or something. Who knows? But
Who
I think you've
knows?
got to analyze it rather than just
Yeah.
blanket. Just a blanket. Nope, it's going to be gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So,
it's going to be difficult, but it's also, like you said, not staking a position one way or the other. I do think it's slowly being accepted, and it is also the science on the medical side. Okay,
mhm.
on the medical side, I don't know if we should support it nationally, recreationally, but on the medical side, I think the science is there that there is a lot of benefits, and we can speak pretty well to that in Ohio because of the opioid crisis that hit our state. I think if we would have had CBD or medical marijuana options, right, then we may have not had that giant crisis because people would have had different methods for pain relief, for joint pain, and
Sure.
we'll never know, right? And I'm
Right.
Monday morning quarterbacking here, and I'm certainly not a pharmacist, but I'm also not the whichever family that's paying $8 billion in criminal violations
Purdue.
for
Yeah.
pushing these meds. So
Yeah. Um, It's going to be interesting. And I think it's going to be interesting sooner rather than later. Because anytime you see this broad-based support nationally on an issue, it's generally a political winner.
Tell you what, if Texas goes, they're going to blame Joe Rogan. He's bringing California. Yeah. He's bringing California habits to Texas.
He's bringing the California love one podcast at a time. Yeah, good. Now we can put a Joe Rogan tag in here and maybe get some pop.
Yeah.
That was organic.
No, I think most employers right now, if you didn't adopt policies when your states were making these transitions, and I'm saying most because 35 states now have some variation.
Sure.
For those of you who are holdouts, get on it now, right? Like, don't be reactive when it comes to human resource policies, right? It is, I say this all the time when we bargain with people, is like, they always go, it's never a problem. And I go, well, I haven't had a heart attack yet. So can I just keep eating cheeseburgers and cheeseburgers and cheeseburgers until I have a heart attack? Or should I change my attitude or implement a strategy or a behavioral modification or a policy before the problem arises? And that's indicative of so much in the US, right? We're such a reactive society when it comes to stuff because of personal freedoms and that implication.
Sure.
But as human resource professionals, we have to be proactive, not reactive. But I'm trying to think if I can think of anything else to add. You got anything else for me? You're on mute.
Oops. No, I think ultimately, I think that hits it pretty well. I mean, ultimately, like you said, I'm not here to advocate or not advocate for personal behaviors. Ultimately, it's a risk assessment you have to take based off what you do, where you are, and the things that go into those kinds of analyses. At this point where we are, there really isn't much changing, but we can really see it's coming. And
I'll throw this out there. Anyone out there in Oregon, right? Let us know how it plays out, because that's straight wild west business out there. I mean, that's crazy.
That's bananas. They may, in certain circumstances, be paying less for a fine than for the product that led to the fine.
Yeah.
So, if you want to talk about incentive structures and behavioral analyses, the penalty for the behavior costing less than the behavior in and of itself, maybe you're just saying, do what you got to do. We'll figure it out later.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens. I'm curious. So I think we've touched on this one pretty well.
Awesome.
So, it was good to be back flying together here after a couple half episodes. But it's that season, it's that time of year for us where we're pulled in a lot of different directions. So thank you for joining me today.
Until next time.
Well, as always, like, subscribe, unsubscribe, resubscribe. Again, I'm not joking about that. Please tell everyone that you know about this. Tell them, hey, these guys are talking about drugs. Maybe that'll draw somebody in.
Yeah, drugs, pornography, and elections. What else can you ask for?
Yeah, we'll get into rock and roll. Well, that I think dated me. I don't know. We'll get into more fun stuff as this goes along. But like I said, like, subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and Google. And then, as always, enjoy our YouTube, because we don't wear button downs and do our hair for nothing. So thanks for joining me, Drew.
All right, later, brother.
See ya. Thanks for joining, everybody. Until next time, goodbye. We want to thank you again for joining us on the Reliably Intermittent podcast. Now it's time for a bit of a disclaimer. This podcast and all others on this feed are for informational purposes only, and not legal advice. No attorney-client relationship is formed by listening to this podcast or any others on the feed. Should you require or want legal advice, we encourage you to reach out to an attorney or statutory legal counsel, as the case may be. Thanks again for joining us, and we will talk to you next time.